The opulent Blackwood mansion stood proudly atop the highest hill in Oak Ridge, California, its manicured lawns and gleaming windows a testament to the wealth and power of the family within. But behind those pristine walls, a storm was brewing, one that would change the lives of everyone involved, especially that of Maria Hernandez, the loyal housekeeper who had served the family for over 2 decades. Maria's day began like any other, the first rays of sunlight barely peeking over the horizon as she made her way up the winding driveway. Her weathered hands clutched a worn leather bag, filled with the personal touches she brought to her work, homemade cleaning solutions passed down through generations, and a small photo of her late husband, her source of strength through trying times. As she entered through the service entrance, the cool air of the mansion enveloped her, a stark contrast to the warmth of her modest apartment. The silence of the early morning was broken only by the soft padding of her sensible shoes on the marble floor. Maria moved with practiced efficiency, her petite frame belying the strength built from years of hard work. She had just begun dusting the antique vases in the grand foyer when a shrill voice shattered the peace. "Maria! Where are you, you useless woman?" The housekeeper flinched, recognizing the voice of Victoria Blackwood, the lady of the house. Victoria swept into the room, her silk robe trailing behind her like a queen's cape. Her face, usually masked by expensive creams and makeup, was bare and twisted with rage. "There you are!" Victoria spat, her eyes narrowing as they fell upon Maria. "How dare you show your face here after what you've done?" Maria's heart raced, confusion etched across her features. "Mrs. Blackwood, I don't understand. What's wrong?" Victoria's hand shot out, grabbing Maria's arm with surprising strength. "Don't play dumb with me. My diamond necklace, the one worth more than you'll earn in 10 lifetimes, is missing. And you're the only one who had access to my room yesterday." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Maria felt the ground shift beneath her feet, her world tilting on its axis. "Mrs. Blackwood, I swear I didn't take anything. I would never." "Silence!" Victoria's voice echoed through the foyer. "I've tolerated your incompetence for far too long. You're fired. Get out of my house this instant, and don't even think about asking for a reference." Tears welled up in Maria's eyes, her voice trembling as she pleaded, "Please, Mrs. Blackwood, I've served your family faithfully for 20 years. I would never steal from you. There must be some mistake." But Victoria was unmoved. She snapped her fingers, and 2 burly security guards seemingly materialized out of thin air. "Escort this thief off the premises immediately. And make sure she doesn't take anything else on her way out." As the guards approached, Maria felt a surge of something she hadn't experienced in years: indignation. She straightened her back, meeting Victoria's gaze with a quiet dignity. "Mrs. Blackwood, I may be leaving your home today, but I leave with my honor intact. One day, the truth will come to light, and you'll realize the mistake you've made. I pray that when that day comes, you'll find it in your heart to ask for forgiveness." Victoria's eyes widened, taken aback by the unexpected display of strength from her usually meek housekeeper. But before she could respond, Maria turned on her heel and walked towards the door, her head held high. As she reached the threshold, Maria paused and looked back at the woman she had served for so long. "Mrs. Blackwood, despite everything, I wish you and your family well. May God bless this house and bring light to the darkness that has taken hold here." With those parting words, Maria stepped out into the morning sun, leaving behind a stunned Victoria and a house that suddenly seemed much colder without her presence. Unbeknownst to both women, a pair of eyes had witnessed the entire exchange from the shadows of the grand staircase. Alexander Blackwood, Victoria's son and heir to the family fortune, had been roused from his sleep by the commotion. His heart raced as he processed what he had just seen and heard. For years, Alexander had harbored a secret affection for Maria, moved by her kindness and strength in the face of his mother's constant belittling. Now, watching her walk away, unjustly accused and humiliated, he felt a fierce determination take root in his chest. He would get to the bottom of this, no matter the cost. As Maria made her way down the long driveway, her modest suitcase in hand, the heavens opened up. Rain poured down, mirroring the tears that streamed down her face. But even in this moment of despair, a small flame of hope flickered in her heart. She had spoken her truth, and somehow, she knew that this was not the end of her story. Meanwhile, back in the mansion, Victoria's triumph was short-lived. As she turned to ascend the stairs, she came face to face with Alexander. The look of disappointment and disgust on her son's face made her falter. "Mother," Alexander said, his voice low and controlled, "what have you done?" Victoria's facade of righteousness cracked slightly. I was protecting our family, Alex. You don't understand." "No, Mother," Alexander interrupted, his eyes flashing with a determination that reminded Victoria eerily of his late father. "I understand perfectly. And I promise you, this isn't over." As Alexander brushed past her, heading towards his room to formulate a plan, Victoria felt a chill run down her spine. For the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of doubt and fear. What had she set in motion with her hasty accusation? Little did any of them know that this rainy morning was just the beginning of a storm that would shake the Blackwood family to its very core, unearthing long-buried secrets and testing the bonds of love, loyalty, and redemption. In the coming days, weeks, and months, the lives of Maria, Alexander, Victoria, and everyone in their orbit would be forever changed. The truth would fight its way to the surface, bringing with it pain, revelation, and ultimately, a chance for healing and justice. As Maria boarded the bus that would take her away from the only life she had known for 2 decades, she closed her eyes and whispered a prayer. "God, give me strength. This is not the end. It's only the beginning." And indeed, it was only the beginning of a tale that would captivate the hearts of many, a story of love, betrayal, redemption, and the indomitable spirit of those who refuse to be broken by life's cruelest twists of fate. The bus pulled away from the curb, carrying Maria towards an uncertain future. But as the Blackwood mansion faded from view, obscured by the curtain of rain, a new chapter was already being written, one that would test the limits of forgiveness, challenge the boundaries of social class, and prove that true strength often comes from the most unexpected places. In the heart of Oak Ridge, California, the stage was set for a drama that would unfold in ways no one could have predicted. The first act had come to a close, but the real story was just beginning to unfold. The days following Maria's unceremonious dismissal from the Blackwood mansion were a blur of tears and sleepless nights. She found herself in a tiny, run-down apartment on the outskirts of Oak Ridge, a far cry from the comfortable quarters she had called home for the past 2 decades. The walls were thin, the paint peeling, and the constant drip of a leaky faucet served as a cruel reminder of how far she had fallen. As Maria sat on the edge of her creaky bed, clutching the photo of her late husband, she couldn't help but wonder how her life had taken such a dramatic turn. "Oh, Carlos," she whispered to the smiling face in the frame, "what am I going to do now?" Meanwhile, back at the Blackwood mansion, Alexander was a man on a mission. He had always been the black sheep of the family, more interested in social justice than social climbing. Now, with Maria gone, he felt a fierce determination to uncover the truth and right the wrong that had been done. Late one night, as the mansion slept, Alexander crept into his mother's study. The room was a testament to Victoria's obsession with appearances, every surface gleamed, every object meticulously placed. But Alexander knew his mother well enough to know that beneath the perfection lay a web of secrets. As he rifled through drawers and files, a small, leather-bound book caught his eye. It was tucked away behind a false panel in the desk, a hiding place he remembered from childhood games. With trembling hands, he opened it, and his world tilted on its axis. The book was a diary, and within its pages lay a story that would shake the very foundations of the Blackwood legacy. Alexander's eyes widened as he read entry after entry, each one more damning than the last. The truth about his father's death, the origins of the family fortune, and most shockingly, the real reason behind Maria's dismissal, it was all there in black and white. "Oh, Mother," Alexander breathed, his voice barely audible in the silent room. "What have you done?" As dawn broke over Oakridge, two very different households stirred to life. In her tiny apartment, Maria rose with the sun, her spirit bent but not broken. She had spent a restless night planning her next move, and though the path ahead was unclear, she was determined to fight for her dignity and her future. With trembling hands, she dialed a number she had memorized years ago but never dared to use. After 3 rings, a gruff voice answered. "Hello?" The voice was thick with sleep and weariness. "Mr. Blackwood?" It's Maria Hernandez." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Maria? Is everything all right?" Maria's voice wavered as she replied, "No, sir. I'm afraid it's not. I need your help." Across town, in a modestly appointed office, Judge Harold Blackwood, Victoria's estranged brother-in-law and Alexander's uncle, listened intently as Maria poured out her story. His face grew increasingly grave with each passing moment. "I see," he said when she had finished. "Maria, what you're describing is a serious matter. If what you're saying is true, we're looking at more than just wrongful termination. This could be part of a larger pattern of abuse and corruption." Maria nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I know it sounds incredible, Mr. Blackwood. But I swear on my husband's grave, every word is true. I've served your family faithfully for 20 years. I would never lie about this." Harold Blackwood regarded her thoughtfully, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. After a long moment, he spoke. "I believe you, Maria. And I think it's high time someone shined a light on what's been happening in that house. But this won't be easy. Victoria has powerful friends, and she won't go down without a fight." "I understand, sir," Maria replied, her voice gaining strength. "But I have to try. Not just for myself, but for all the others who've suffered under her cruelty." As Maria and Harold began to formulate a plan, across town, Alexander was facing a crisis of his own. The revelations in his mother's diary had left him reeling, questioning everything he thought he knew about his family. He found Victoria in the conservatory, tending to her prized orchids with meticulous care. The morning light streaming through the glass ceiling cast a deceptively peaceful glow over the scene. "Mother," Alexander said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "We need to talk." Victoria turned, a rare smile gracing her features as she beheld her son. But the smile quickly faded as she saw the look in Alexander's eyes and the diary clutched in his hand. "Where did you get that?" she hissed, all pretense of warmth evaporating. Alexander's grip on the diary tightened. "It doesn't matter. What matters is what's in here. How could you, Mother? How could you do this to Maria? To Dad? To our entire family?" Victoria's face hardened, her eyes becoming chips of ice. "You don't understand, Alexander. I did what I had to do to protect this family, to ensure our legacy." "Legacy?" Alexander spat the word like a curse. "What legacy? One built on lies, theft, and cruelty? That's not a legacy, Mother. It's a shame." As mother and son faced off, the air thick with decades of secrets and lies, a storm was brewing on the horizon. In his office, Harold Blackwood was making phone calls, setting in motion a series of events that would rock Oakridge to its core. And in her tiny apartment, Maria knelt in prayer, asking for strength for the battle ahead. She knew the road would be long and difficult, but for the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope. Little did any of them know that their lives were about to intersect in ways they could never have imagined. As the days passed, Maria threw herself into building a case against the Blackwoods. With Harold's guidance, she began documenting every instance of mistreatment, every overheard conversation that hinted at impropriety. It was painstaking work, dredging up painful memories, but Maria was fueled by a determination she hadn't known she possessed. One evening, as she was sorting through old pay stubs and work logs, there was a knock at her door. Maria froze, her heart pounding. She wasn't expecting anyone, and few people knew where she lived now. Cautiously, she approached the door. "Who is it?" she called, her voice wavering slightly. "It's me, Maria." "Alexander." Maria's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. After a moment's hesitation, she opened the door. Alexander stood in the hallway, looking nothing like the polished heir to the Blackwood fortune. His hair was disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed, and he clutched a thick folder to his chest like a lifeline. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Maria nodded, stepping aside to let him enter. As Alexander took in the cramped, sparsely furnished apartment, his face crumpled with guilt. "Oh, Maria," he breathed. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea." Maria shook her head, cutting him off. "It's not your fault, Mr. Alexander. You didn't do this to me." Alexander met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and determination. "No, but my family did. And I'm here to make it right." He held out the folder. "I found this in my mother's study. It's everything, Maria. Financial records, correspondence, even a confession about the diamond necklace. She framed you to cover up her own embezzlement." Maria's hands shook as she took the folder. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why are you doing this?" Alexander's response was immediate and heartfelt. "Because it's the right thing to do. And because..." He paused, gathering his courage. "Because I care about you, Maria. I always have." The air between them crackled with unspoken emotions, years of stolen glances and suppressed feelings bubbling to the surface. But before either of them could speak, Maria's phone rang, shattering the moment. It was Harold Blackwood. "Maria," he said, his voice urgent. "You need to turn on the news. Right now." With trembling hands, Maria switched on the small TV in the corner of the room. Alexander moved to stand beside her, their shoulders barely touching. The local news was in the middle of a breaking story. The anchor's voice filled the tiny apartment. Shocking allegations of fraud and embezzlement against prominent Oak Ridge socialite Victoria Blackwood. Sources close to the investigation say that Mrs. Blackwood has been using her charity foundation as a personal slush fund for years, siphoning off millions meant for underprivileged children. Maria and Alexander stood in stunned silence as the report continued, detailing years of financial misdeeds and cover-ups. The empire that Victoria had built was crumbling before their eyes. "It's over," Alexander murmured, a mix of relief and sadness in his voice. "She can't hurt anyone else now." Maria turned to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "What happens now?" Alexander took her hand, his touch gentle but sure. "Now, we make things right. Together." As the news continued to unfold on the small TV screen, Maria and Alexander stood hand in hand, the first tentative steps towards a new future stretching out before them. The road ahead would not be easy, there would be trials to face, wounds to heal, and a lifetime of damage to undo. But in that moment, in a tiny apartment on the outskirts of Oak Ridge, a seed of hope took root. It was a hope born of shared pain, mutual understanding, and the unshakable belief that love, in its purest form, could overcome even the deepest of betrayals. Outside, the sun was setting on Oak Ridge, casting long shadows across the town. But for Maria and Alexander, a new day was just beginning to dawn. As night fell over Oak Ridge, the Blackwood mansion was a hive of frantic activity. Victoria, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her, was in a state of panic. She barked orders at her remaining staff, demanding they shred documents and pack her most valuable possessions. Faster, she shrieked, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms. We don't have much time before they come for me. But even as Victoria plotted her escape, fate was closing in. Unbeknownst to her, the mansion was already surrounded by law enforcement, waiting for the order to move in. In the chaos of the moment, a small, ornate box tumbled from Victoria's grasp, spilling its contents across the marble floor. Among the scattered jewels and papers, a single photograph fluttered to rest at Victoria's feet. She froze, her eyes fixed on the image. It was a picture from long ago, Victoria, much younger, standing beside a man who could only be Alexander's father. But it wasn't the familiar faces that caught her attention. It was the woman in the background, barely visible but unmistakable. Maria. As Victoria stared at the photograph, a flood of memories washed over her. Memories she had long suppressed, of a time before wealth and status had hardened her heart. Of friendship, of loyalty, of the woman who had stood by her side through the darkest days of her life. For the first time in years, Victoria felt the icy walls around her heart begin to crack. But it was too late. The sound of breaking glass and shouts filled the air as the police stormed the mansion. As handcuffs were clasped around her wrists, Victoria's eyes never left the photograph on the floor, a silent testament to the life she could have had, the person she could have been. As Victoria was led away, the first drops of rain began to fall, washing away the last vestiges of the Blackwood dynasty's reign over Oak Ridge. Across town, in Maria's small apartment, a different scene was unfolding. Maria and Alexander sat side by side on the worn couch, the weight of the day's events heavy on their shoulders. I can't believe it's really over, Maria murmured, her voice thick with emotion. Alexander squeezed her hand gently. Not over, he corrected. Just beginning. As they sat in companionable silence, the rain pattering against the window, a knock at the door startled them both. Maria opened it to find Harold Blackwood standing in the hallway, his expression grave but kind. It's done, he said simply. Victoria's been taken into custody. But there's something else you both need to know. Harold stepped into the apartment, his eyes moving from Maria to Alexander and back again. In light of the evidence we've uncovered, the board of directors has made a decision. Alexander, they want you to take over as CEO of Blackwood Industries. Alexander's eyes widened in surprise. Me? But I don't know if I'm ready for that. Harold's gaze softened. You're more ready than you know, son. And you won't be alone. He turned to Maria. The board also wants to offer you a position, Maria. They believe your years of service and your intimate knowledge of the company's workings make you invaluable. Maria's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. I don't know what to say. Alexander stood, moving to stand beside her. Say yes, he urged gently. We can do this together. Make things right, the way they always should have been. As Maria looked from Alexander to Harold and back again, she felt a warmth blooming in her chest, a feeling of belonging, of purpose, that she had thought lost forever. Yes, she whispered, her voice gaining strength. Yes, I'll do it. Harold nodded, a smile creasing his weathered face. Good. We have a lot of work ahead of us, but I believe we can turn this company into something we can all be proud of. As Harold bid them good night and left, Maria and Alexander found themselves alone once more. The air between them was charged with possibility, with the promise of a future neither of them had dared to imagine. Alexander took Maria's hands in his eyes shining with emotion. "Maria," he began, his voice husky. "I know this is all happening so fast, but I need you to know something. I've cared for you for so long, admired your strength, your kindness, your unshakable spirit. Will you give me a chance to show you how much you mean to me?" Maria felt her heart skip a beat. For so long, she had buried her feelings, convinced that the divide between them was too great to cross. But now, with the old barriers crumbling, she allowed herself to hope. "Yes," she whispered, tears of joy spilling down her cheeks. "Yes, Alexander. I will." As they embraced, the rain outside began to ease, the clouds parting to reveal a sky full of stars. It was a new beginning, not just for Maria and Alexander, but for all of Oak Ridge. In the days and weeks that followed, Oak Ridge witnessed a transformation. Under Alexander and Maria's joint leadership, Blackwood Industries began to change, focusing on ethical business practices and community development. The company that had once been synonymous with greed and corruption was slowly but surely becoming a force for good. Victoria, facing a long legal battle and the loss of her social standing, found herself with ample time to reflect on her choices. In the quiet of her cell, she began the long, painful process of confronting her past and the person she had become. And in a small, cozy apartment on the outskirts of town, Maria and Alexander built a life together, their love a testament to the power of forgiveness and the enduring strength of the human spirit. As summer turned to fall in Oak Ridge, the town buzzed with the news of an upcoming event, the grand reopening of the Blackwood Foundation, now dedicated to providing education and opportunities for underprivileged children. On the day of the ceremony, Maria stood before a mirror, hardly recognizing the woman who looked back at her. Gone was the timid housekeeper in a faded uniform. In her place stood a confident, radiant woman in an elegant suit, ready to take on the world. Alexander appeared behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Ready?" he asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. Maria smiled, leaning into his embrace. "Ready," she replied. As they stepped out into the warm California sunshine, hand in hand, Maria marveled at the twists and turns that had brought her to this moment. From the depths of despair, she had risen, her unwavering faith and kindness lighting the way. And as she looked up at Alexander, saw the love shining in his eyes, she knew that this was only the beginning of their story. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, bound by a love that had overcome every obstacle. In the end, it was not wealth or status that had brought Maria true happiness, but the strength of her character and the purity of her heart. As she and Alexander walked towards the podium, ready to address the gathered crowd, Maria felt a sense of peace wash over her. The journey had been long and painful, but it had led her here, to a place where she could make a real difference, where her voice could be heard, and where love had triumphed over adversity. As they took their places on the stage, Maria caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd. Harold Blackwood stood at the back, a proud smile on his weathered face. Beside him, to Maria's shock, stood Victoria. The once proud matriarch of the Blackwood family looked pale and drawn, the strain of recent events evident in the lines of her face. But as her eyes met Maria's, there was something new there, a glimmer of remorse, of understanding. Maria felt Alexander tense beside her, but she placed a calming hand on his arm. With a small nod to Victoria, Maria turned to face the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and strong. "Thank you all for being here today. The journey that has brought us to this moment has been one of hardship, of betrayal, but also of redemption." As Maria spoke, her words painting a vision of hope and second chances, she felt the weight of the past lifting from her shoulders. This was her moment, not just to tell her story, but to set a new course for the future. The Blackwood Foundation, she continued, will stand as a beacon of hope for those who have been overlooked, for those who need a helping hand to reach their full potential. We are committed to breaking the cycles of poverty and injustice, to creating opportunities where none existed before. Alexander stepped forward, his hand finding Maria's as he added his voice to hers. Together, he said, we will build a legacy not of wealth and power, but of compassion and positive change. This is our promise to you, and to all of Oak Ridge. As applause erupted from the crowd, Maria felt tears of joy prick at her eyes. This was more than she had ever dared to dream, a platform to help others, a chance to right the wrongs of the past, and a love that had overcome every obstacle. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Maria found herself face to face with Victoria. For a moment, the two women simply looked at each other, years of history hanging between them. Finally, Victoria spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry, Maria. For everything. Maria studied the woman before her, not the imperious employer she had once feared, but a human being capable of growth and change. Thank you, Victoria, she replied softly. I hope you find peace. As Victoria nodded and turned away, Maria felt the last pieces of her old life fall away. The future stretched out before her, bright with promise. That night, as she and Alexander stood on the balcony of their new home, overlooking the twinkling lights of Oak Ridge, Maria felt a sense of completion. The girl who had arrived in this town decades ago, full of hope and determination, had finally found her place in the world. What are you thinking about? Alexander asked, wrapping his arms around her. Maria smiled, leaning back into his embrace. I'm thinking about how far we've come, she replied. And how excited I am for where we're going. Alexander pressed a kiss to her temple. Together, he murmured. Together, Maria agreed. As the stars shone overhead, Maria said a silent prayer of thanks. Her journey had been long and often painful, but it had led her here, to a place of love, purpose, and the opportunity to make a real difference in the world. The path ahead would not always be easy, she knew. There would be challenges to face, obstacles to overcome. But with Alexander by her side, and the strength she had discovered within herself, Maria was ready for whatever the future might hold. In the end, it was not the grandeur of the Blackwood mansion or the glitter of high society that had brought Maria happiness. It was the simple truth she had always known in her heart, that kindness, integrity, and love were the most powerful forces in the world. As she and Alexander turned to go inside, hand in hand, Maria knew that this was not the end of her story. It was, in many ways, just the beginning. And she couldn't wait to see what the next chapter would bring. The lights of Oak Ridge twinkled below, a reminder of the lives they would touch, the changes they would make. And in that moment, Maria Hernandez, once a humble housekeeper, now a beacon of hope and change, knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The journey had been long, but the destination was worth every step. The warm glow of success that had enveloped Maria and Alexander in the wake of the Blackwood Foundation's relaunch began to fade as the harsh light of reality set in. The path of redemption, they were quickly learning, was far from smooth. It was a crisp autumn morning when the first cracks began to show. Maria sat at her new desk in the Blackwood Industries headquarters, poring over financial reports, when a gentle knock at the door pulled her from her concentration. Come in, she called, looking up to see Alexander enter, his face drawn with worry. We have a problem, he said without preamble, sinking into the chair across from her. The board is pushing back against our new initiatives. They're saying we're moving too fast, that the changes we're implementing are too radical. Maria felt a familiar knot of anxiety form in her stomach. But they agreed to these changes. They said they supported our vision. Alexander ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Maria had come to recognize as a sign of his frustration. They did, but now that they're seeing the impact on the bottom line, they're getting nervous. Some of them are even talking about bringing in outside management. The implications of his words hung heavy in the air between them. Everything they had worked for, everything they had dreamed of, was suddenly at risk. Maria reached across the desk, taking Alexander's hand in hers. "We'll figure this out," she said, her voice steady despite the fear threatening to overwhelm her. "We've come too far to give up now." As they sat there, hands clasped, a commotion in the outer office caught their attention. Raised voices, the sound of something shattering. Maria and Alexander exchanged a worried glance before hurrying to investigate. They opened the door to find chaos. In the center of the room stood Victoria Blackwood, her once impeccable appearance now disheveled, her eyes wild with a mixture of anger and desperation. "How dare you?" she screeched, pointing an accusing finger at Maria. "How dare you sit in my office, pretend to run my company?" Security guards flanked Victoria, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. Employees stood frozen, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of shock and morbid fascination. Alexander stepped forward, his voice low and controlled. "Mother, you shouldn't be here. You're violating the terms of your release." Victoria's laugh was bitter, tinged with hysteria. "Release? Is that what you call it? I'm a prisoner in my own home, stripped of everything I've worked for, while you and this servant play house in my company." Maria felt the old familiar sting of Victoria's words, but she refused to let it show. Instead, she moved to stand beside Alexander, presenting a united front. "Mrs. Blackwood," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I understand you're upset, but this isn't the way to handle it. Please, let's talk about this privately." For a moment, it seemed as though Victoria might listen to reason. But then her gaze fell on Maria and Alexander's joined hands, and something in her snapped. With a cry of rage, Victoria lunged forward, her manicured nails raking across Maria's cheek. "You stole my son," she shrieked. "You stole my life." The room erupted into chaos. Security guards rushed to restrain Victoria, while Alexander pulled Maria back, shielding her with his body. Employees scattered, some rushing to call the police, others simply fleeing the scene. As Victoria was led away, still shouting accusations and threats, Maria sagged against Alexander, the adrenaline draining from her body. She raised a trembling hand to her cheek, feeling the sting of the scratches Victoria had left behind. "Are you all right?" Alexander asked, his voice thick with concern and barely suppressed anger. Maria nodded, unable to find her voice. The reality of their situation was crashing down around her. This wasn't just about running a company or righting past wrongs anymore. This was a battle for their very lives, for the future they had dared to dream of together. In the days that followed, the incident with Victoria became front-page news. Blackwood heiress assaults former housekeeper screamed the headlines, accompanied by grainy security camera footage of the attack. The board of directors called an emergency meeting, citing concerns about the negative publicity and the stability of the company's leadership. Maria and Alexander found themselves fighting on all fronts, against the board's skepticism, against the media's sensationalized reporting, and against the whispers and doubts that had begun to circulate among the employees. Late one night, as they sat in Alexander's office, surrounded by stacks of reports and legal documents, Maria finally gave voice to the fear that had been growing in her heart. "Maybe they're right," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the city lights twinkling beyond the window. "Maybe we're in over our heads. Maybe I don't belong here after all." Alexander was at her side in an instant, kneeling before her chair and taking her hands in his. "Don't say that," he said fiercely. "You belong here more than anyone. You're the heart of this company, Maria. Without you, none of this means anything." Tears welled in Maria's eyes as she met Alexander's gaze. "But look at what's happening. The board is against us, the media is tearing us apart, and your mother. She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Alexander's jaw tightened at the mention of Victoria, but his voice remained gentle. My mother made her choices, Maria. We can't let her actions dictate our future. As for the rest, he paused, a determined glint in his eye. We'll just have to prove them all wrong. As they sat there, drawing strength from each other's presence, neither of them noticed the figure lurking in the shadows outside the office. Harold Blackwood watched his nephew and Maria through the glass, a mixture of pride and concern etched on his weathered face. He had known it wouldn't be easy for them, had tried to prepare them for the challenges they would face. But seeing them now, bowed but unbroken by the storm raging around them, Harold felt a surge of hope. Perhaps, he thought, these two truly were the ones to redeem the Blackwood name. With a silent prayer for their success, Harold slipped away, already formulating plans to help them weather the storm. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing within the walls of Blackwood Industries. Maria arrived early, determined to face whatever challenges the day might bring head-on. As she stepped off the elevator, she was met by a sight that stopped her in her tracks. The entire floor was filled with employees, all of them standing silently, their eyes fixed on her. For a heart-stopping moment, Maria feared the worst. Had they all turned against her? But then, from the back of the crowd, a single voice called out. We're with you, Maria. The words seemed to break a dam. Suddenly, the air was filled with cheers and applause. Employees surged forward, offering words of encouragement and support. Maria felt overwhelmed by the outpouring of affection, tears pricking at her eyes as she realized that she wasn't alone in this fight. Alexander appeared at her side, his face lit with a mixture of surprise and joy. Together, they stood before their team, humbled by their loyalty and buoyed by their support. As the impromptu gathering dispersed and people returned to their work, there was a new energy in the air. The tide, it seemed, was beginning to turn. But even as Maria allowed herself to hope, she knew that the real battles were still to come. The board meeting loomed on the horizon, a make-or-break moment that would determine the future of Blackwood Industries and her place within it. In the days leading up to the meeting, Maria and Alexander worked tirelessly, preparing their presentation and rallying support from key stakeholders. They reached out to community leaders, demonstrating the positive impact their new initiatives were having. They pored over financial projections, building a case for the long-term benefits of their ethical business model. The night before the board meeting, Maria found herself unable to sleep. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Alexander, and made her way to the balcony of their apartment. As she stood there, gazing out at the sleeping city, Maria felt the weight of tomorrow's meeting pressing down on her. Everything they had worked for, everything they had dreamed of, hung in the balance. A warm hand on her shoulder startled her from her reverie. She turned to find Alexander standing beside her, his eyes filled with understanding. Couldn't sleep either? He asked softly. Maria shook her head, leaning into his embrace. I'm scared, Alex, she admitted. What if we can't convince them? What if we lose everything? Alexander was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the first hints of dawn were beginning to appear. When he spoke, his voice was filled with a quiet determination. We won't lose everything, he said. No matter what happens in that boardroom, we'll still have each other. And as long as we have that, we can start over. We can build something new. Maria looked up at him, struck by the depth of love and commitment in his eyes. In that moment, she knew that he was right. Whatever challenges they faced, they would face them together. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Maria felt a sense of peace settle over her. They had come so far, overcome so much. Whatever the day might bring, she was ready to face it. Hand in hand, Maria and Alexander watched the new day dawn, their hearts full of hope and determination. The battle ahead would not be easy, but they were no longer the people they had been when this journey began. They were stronger now, tempered by adversity and bound together by a love that had overcome every obstacle. As they turned to go inside and prepare for the day ahead, Maria paused, looking back at the city sprawled before them. This was her home now, these people her family. And she would fight with everything she had to protect it all. The boardroom was silent as Maria and Alexander concluded their presentation. The tension in the air was palpable as the board members exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Maria's heart pounded in her chest as she waited for someone to speak. She could feel Alexander's hand, warm and reassuring, at the small of her back. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. Finally, the chairman of the board, a stern-faced man named Richard Hawthorne, cleared his throat. "Mr. Blackwood, Ms. Hernandez," he began, his tone neutral, "you've certainly given us a lot to think about." He paused, his eyes scanning the room before settling back on Maria and Alexander. "I must admit, when we first agreed to this unconventional arrangement, many of us had our doubts. We wondered if you had the experience, the knowledge, to lead a company of this size and complexity." Maria felt her heart sink. This was it, she thought. They were about to lose everything. But then, to her amazement, a small smile crossed Richard's face. "I'm pleased to say," he continued, "that you have proven those doubts unfounded. The progress you've made, the positive changes you've implemented, are nothing short of remarkable." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Maria hardly dared to breathe, scarcely able to believe what she was hearing. "There will, of course, be challenges ahead," Richard went on. "Change is never easy, especially in a company with as much history as Blackwood Industries. But after careful consideration, the board has decided to fully endorse your vision for the future of this company." The room erupted into applause. Maria felt tears of joy and relief spring to her eyes as Alexander pulled her into a tight embrace. They had done it. Against all odds, they had won the board's approval. As the meeting adjourned and board members came forward to offer their congratulations, Maria caught sight of a familiar face hovering near the door. Harold Blackwood stood watching the scene, a proud smile on his weathered face. When their eyes met, he gave her a small nod of approval before slipping quietly from the room. Later that evening, as Maria and Alexander celebrated their victory with a quiet dinner at home, a knock at the door interrupted their meal. Alexander answered it to find a courier holding a small package. "Delivery for Ms. Maria Hernandez," the young man said, handing over the parcel before departing with a polite nod. Curious, Maria opened the package. Inside, she found a small, intricately carved wooden box. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the lid, gasping at what she saw inside. Nestled on a bed of velvet was a delicate silver locket. Maria recognized it immediately. It had belonged to Alexander's grandmother, a family heirloom passed down through generations of Blackwood women. A note tucked beside the locket caught her eye. With shaking hands, she unfolded it, her eyes widening as she read the message written in a familiar, elegant script. "Maria, I was wrong about you. About so many things. This locket has been in our family for generations, worn by women of strength and character. It belongs with you now. I hope that one day, you can find it in your heart to forgive me. Victoria." Maria looked up at Alexander, her eyes brimming with tears. Without a word, he took the locket from the box and gently fastened it around her neck. As Maria touched the cool silver resting against her skin, she felt a sense of coming full circle. From a humble housekeeper to the co-leader of Blackwood Industries, her journey had been one of tremendous growth and change. But through it all, she had remained true to herself, to the values that had guided her from the very beginning. Alexander pulled her close, pressing a tender kiss to her forehead. "You did it, Maria," he murmured. "You changed everything, the company, my mother, me. You've created a legacy of kindness and integrity that will last for generations." Maria smiled up at him, her heart full of love and gratitude. "We did it," she corrected gently. "Together." As they stood there, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, Maria knew that this was just the beginning. There would be more challenges to face, more battles to fight. But with Alexander by her side, and the strength she had discovered within herself, she was ready for whatever the future might hold. The journey had been long and often painful, but it had led her here, to a place of love, purpose, and the opportunity to make a real difference in the world. And for Maria Hernandez, once a humble housekeeper and now a beacon of hope and change, that was more than enough. It was everything. The warm California sun streamed through the windows of Maria's office at Blackwood Industries, casting a golden glow over the piles of paperwork scattered across her desk. It had been 6 months since the board's vote of confidence, and the company was thriving under her and Alexander's leadership. But even as they celebrated their successes, neither of them could shake the feeling that their struggles were far from over. Maria's fingers absently traced the outline of the silver locket that hung around her neck, Victoria's peace offering, as she pored over the latest financial reports. The numbers were good, better than they had dared to hope, but there was something nagging at the back of her mind. Something wasn't quite right. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She looked up to see Alexander leaning against the doorframe, a concerned expression on his face. "You've been staring at those reports for hours," he said, crossing the room to perch on the edge of her desk. "What's wrong?" Maria sighed, pushing the papers away. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "Everything looks good on paper, but I can't shake this feeling that we're missing something." Alexander's brow furrowed as he picked up one of the reports. "Have you talked to the auditors? Maybe they can spot something we've overlooked." Before Maria could respond, her phone buzzed with an incoming text. Her eyes widened as she read the message. "It's from your Uncle Harold," she said, her voice tight with worry. "He wants to meet us. Says it's urgent." An hour later, Maria and Alexander found themselves in a dimly lit corner of a small coffee shop on the outskirts of town. Harold Blackwood sat across from them, his usually jovial face drawn and serious. "I'm sorry to drag you out here like this," he began, his voice low. "But what I have to tell you, it couldn't be said at the office. There are ears everywhere." Maria felt a chill run down her spine at his words. "What's going on, Harold?" The older man took a deep breath, his eyes darting around the cafe before settling back on Maria and Alexander. "I've been doing some digging," he said. "Into the company's past, into some of the deals your father made before he died." He looked at Alexander. "Son, I'm afraid what I've found, it's not good." Over the next hour, Harold laid out a tale that seemed more suited to a crime novel than their reality. Years of systematic fraud, offshore accounts, bribes paid to government officials, a web of corruption that stretched back decades and implicated some of the most powerful people in the country. "But that's all in the past," Alexander protested, his face pale. "We've changed things. We're running the company differently now." Harold shook his head sadly. "I'm afraid it's not that simple. Some of these deals, they're still ongoing. And there are people out there who stand to lose a lot if they come to light." Maria felt as though the ground was shifting beneath her feet. Everything they had worked for, everything they had built, was suddenly in jeopardy. "What can we do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Harold reached across the table, clasping their hands in his. "You need to be careful," he warned. "There are powerful forces at work here. Forces that won't hesitate to destroy you to protect themselves. As they left the cafe, the bright California sun seemed to mock the darkness that had descended upon them. Maria and Alexander walked in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, the weight of Harold's revelations heavy on their shoulders. Back at their apartment, Maria paced the living room, her mind racing. "We have to do something," she said, turning to Alexander. "We can't just ignore this." Alexander ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Maria had come to recognize as a sign of his frustration. "I know," he said. "But what? If we go public with this, it could bring down the entire company. Thousands of people could lose their jobs." Maria stopped pacing, her eyes meeting Alexander's. In that moment, she saw her own fear and determination reflected back at her. "Then we do it carefully," she said. "We find a way to make things right without destroying everything we've built." As they stayed up late into the night, planning their next moves, neither of them noticed the sleek black car parked across the street, its tinted windows hiding the figure watching their apartment with cold, calculating eyes. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of clandestine meetings and late-night research sessions. Maria and Alexander worked tirelessly, piecing together the puzzle of Blackwood Industries' dark past. They brought in a small team of trusted employees, swearing them to secrecy as they worked to untangle the web of corruption. But as they delved deeper, the danger grew. Strange cars began following them home from work. Their phones started picking up odd clicks and static. One morning, they arrived at the office to find Maria's desk ransacked, papers strewn everywhere. The message was clear: someone knew what they were doing, and they weren't happy about it. Despite the growing threat, Maria and Alexander pressed on. They were close to unraveling the entire scheme, to finding a way to make things right without destroying the company they had worked so hard to reform. It was a crisp autumn evening when everything came to a head. Maria was working late, combing through a new batch of documents Harold had uncovered. The office was quiet, most of the employees having gone home hours ago. A soft noise from the outer office caught her attention. "Hello?" she called, rising from her desk. "Is someone there?" There was no response, but Maria could have sworn she heard the sound of footsteps. Her heart racing, she reached for her phone to call security. Suddenly, the lights went out, plunging the office into darkness. Maria fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking as she tried to dial Alexander's number. Before she could press call, a hand clamped over her mouth, an arm wrapping around her waist and pulling her back against a solid chest. Not a sound, a gruff voice whispered in her ear. "You're coming with us, Ms. Hernandez. There are some people very interested in having a chat with you." Maria's mind raced as she was led from the office, her captors moving with practiced efficiency. How had they gotten past security? Who were they working for? As they reached the parking garage, Maria saw a van with tinted windows waiting, its engine running. This was it, she thought. If they got her in that van, she might never be seen again. With a surge of desperate strength, Maria stomped on her captor's foot and threw her head back, feeling a satisfying crunch as her skull connected with his nose. He cursed, his grip loosening just enough for her to break free. Maria ran, her heart pounding in her ears. She could hear shouts behind her, footsteps giving chase. She darted between parked cars, trying to remember where the nearest exit was. Just as she thought she might make it, a figure stepped out from behind a pillar, blocking her path. Maria skidded to a stop, her eyes widening in shock as she recognized the face of her new captor. "You?" she gasped, disbelief coloring her voice. Before the figure could respond, the sound of screeching tires filled the garage. Headlights cut through the darkness as a car came barreling around the corner, skidding to a stop between Maria and her pursuers. The passenger door flew open, and Maria heard Alexander's voice, frantic and urgent. "Maria! Get in!" Without hesitation, Maria dove into the car. As soon as the door slammed shut, Alexander floored the accelerator, sending them speeding out of the garage and into the night. "Are you okay?" Alexander asked, his eyes darting between Maria and the rearview mirror, checking for pursuit. "What happened?" Maria's mind was reeling, the adrenaline from her escape still coursing through her veins. "They were waiting for me," she said, her voice shaky. "In the office. They tried to kidnap me. But Alexander, you won't believe who I saw. It was..." Her words were cut off by the sound of shattering glass. The rear window exploded inward as a bullet tore through it, missing them by inches. "Get down!" Alexander yelled, swerving the car wildly as more shots rang out behind them. Maria's heart pounded as she crouched in her seat, glass crunching beneath her. This wasn't supposed to happen. They were supposed to be running a company, not fleeing for their lives like characters in some action movie. Alexander's face was set in grim determination as he navigated the streets of Oak Ridge, trying to shake their pursuers. "We need to get somewhere safe," he said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Somewhere they won't think to look for us." As the car sped through the night, weaving through traffic and taking sharp turns down side streets, Maria's mind raced. Who could they trust? Where could they go that was truly safe? Suddenly, an idea struck her. "I know a place," she said, sitting up cautiously. "Take the next right. We're going to see an old friend." Alexander followed her directions without question, his trust in her absolute even in this moment of crisis. As they drove, leaving the bright lights of the city behind, Maria prayed that her instincts were right. That the person they were going to see would be willing to help them, despite everything that had happened in the past. An hour later, they pulled up in front of a small, nondescript house on the outskirts of town. The neighborhood was quiet, the houses dark save for the occasional porch light. "Are you sure about this?" Alexander asked as they sat in the car, staring at the house. Maria took a deep breath, steeling herself. "No," she admitted. "But it's our best shot." Hand in hand, they approached the front door. Maria's finger hovered over the doorbell for a moment before she pressed it, the cheerful chime at odds with the gravity of their situation. Long seconds ticked by. Just as Maria was beginning to think they had made a mistake, that no one was home, they heard movement from inside. The porch light flickered on, and the door opened slowly. Victoria Blackwood stood in the doorway, her eyes widening in surprise as she took in the disheveled appearance of her son and the woman she had once treated so cruelly. "Alexander?" "Maria," she said, confusion evident in her voice. "What on earth?" "We need your help, Mother," Alexander cut in, his voice urgent. "Please. We have nowhere else to go." For a moment, Victoria hesitated, her gaze moving between them. Then, without a word, she stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. As the door closed behind them, Maria felt a wave of relief wash over her. They were safe, at least for now. But as she looked at Victoria's guarded expression, she knew that the real battle was just beginning. The living room of Victoria's modest home was a far cry from the opulent mansion where Maria had once worked. Simple, functional furniture had replaced the antiques and artwork. Family photos lined the walls, a visual history of the Blackwood family, including several of Alexander as a child. Victoria gestured for them to sit on the worn but comfortable sofa. "I'll make some tea," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Then you can tell me what this is all about." As Victoria busied herself in the kitchen, Maria and Alexander exchanged glances. This was not the reception either of them had expected. The Victoria they knew would have demanded answers immediately, her tone sharp and accusatory. This calmer, more measured response was unsettling in its unfamiliarity. When Victoria returned with a tray of steaming mugs, the trio sat in awkward silence for a moment. It was Alexander who finally broke the tension, launching into an explanation of everything that had transpired, the corruption they had uncovered, the threats, and finally, the attempt on Maria's life. Victoria listened without interruption, her face growing more grave with each passing moment. When Alexander finished, she set down her mug and looked at them both, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "I was afraid something like this might happen," she said softly. Maria leaned forward, her brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" Victoria sighed, suddenly looking every one of her years. There were always rumors, whispers of deals that weren't quite above board. "Your father," she looked at Alexander, "he tried to shield me from the worst of it. But I knew. Deep down, I always knew." "And you never said anything?" Alexander's voice was tight with suppressed anger. Victoria met her son's gaze unflinchingly. "What could I have said? By the time I realized the full extent of it, your father was gone, and I was in too deep. I told myself I was protecting you, protecting our family's legacy. But the truth is, I was protecting myself." Maria felt a surge of emotions, anger at the years of deception, pity for the woman Victoria had become, and a grudging respect for her honesty now. "So what do we do?" she asked. "How do we fix this?" Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant as she considered the question. When she spoke, her voice was filled with a resolve Maria had never heard before. "We bring it all to light," she said. "Every dirty deal, every corrupt official. We tear it all down and start over." Alexander stared at his mother in disbelief. "But that could destroy everything. The company, our reputation, is already at risk," Victoria cut him off. "You've built something good, something I never had the courage to do. If we don't act now, all of that will be lost anyway. At least this way, we have a chance to do the right thing." As the night wore on, the three of them huddled around Victoria's kitchen table, poring over documents and forming a plan. It was a surreal scene, the former housekeeper, the heir, and the disgraced matriarch working together to save not just a company, but their very lives. As dawn broke, casting a pale light through the kitchen windows, Maria felt a glimmer of hope. They had a plan, dangerous and risky, but a plan nonetheless. And more importantly, they had each other. Looking around the table at Alexander's determined face and Victoria's newfound resolve, Maria knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The road ahead would be difficult, fraught with danger and uncertainty. But for the first time since this nightmare began, Maria believed they might just have a chance. As they prepared to put their plan into action, Maria stepped outside for a moment, needing to clear her head. The cool morning air was a balm to her frayed nerves. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath and steeling herself for what was to come. A gentle hand on her shoulder made her turn. Victoria stood there, her eyes filled with an emotion Maria couldn't quite place. "I owe you an apology," Victoria said softly. "Many apologies, in fact. For how I treated you, for the things I said and did. You've shown more strength and integrity than I ever gave you credit for." Maria felt tears prick at her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more than you know." As they stood there, the rising sun painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Maria felt a shift in the air between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, there was too much history for that. But understanding, perhaps. And the beginning of something new. Inside, Alexander watched the interaction between his mother and the woman he loved, his heart full of a bittersweet hope. Whatever the coming days might bring, he knew that this moment, this unlikely alliance, would be the key to their survival. As Maria and Victoria came back inside, Alexander stood, ready to face whatever came next. "Are we ready?" he asked, looking between the two women who had shaped his life in such profound ways. Maria nodded, her chin lifted in determination. Victoria squared her shoulders, a glint of her old fire returning to her eyes. "Let's do this," she said. Together, the unlikely trio stepped out into the morning light, ready to take on the corrupt empire that threatened everything they held dear. The battle ahead would be fierce, the stakes higher than ever before. But with truth as their weapon and each other as their strength, they were ready to fight for their future and for justice. As they drove back towards the city, towards the confrontation that would determine their fate, Maria felt a sense of calm settle over her. Whatever happened next, she knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The humble housekeeper who had once been invisible was now at the forefront of a battle that could change everything. And she was ready. The sun had barely risen over Oak Ridge when Maria, Alexander, and Victoria pulled up to the Blackwood Industries headquarters. The building loomed before them, its glass facade reflecting the golden light of dawn. To Maria, it seemed both familiar and alien, a place she had come to call home, now transformed into a battleground. "Are you sure about this?" Alexander asked, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Once we go in there, there's no turning back." Maria took a deep breath, her hand unconsciously moving to touch the locket around her neck. "We have to do this," she said, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. "For everyone who's been hurt by this corruption. For the future of the company. For us." Victoria, sitting in the back seat, leaned forward. "Maria's right," she said, her voice carrying a weight of regret and determination. "It's time to set things right, no matter the cost." With a shared nod of resolve, they exited the car and made their way into the building. The lobby was quiet, the early hour meaning only security and a few early risers were present. As they crossed to the elevators, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. In the executive floor, they found Harold waiting for them, his face grave. "I've gathered everyone as you asked," he said. "The board, the senior executives, they're all in the main conference room. And..." He hesitated, glancing at Victoria, "I've alerted the authorities. They're standing by." Victoria straightened her shoulders, a flicker of her old imperious manner returning. "Good," she said. "It's time to face the music." As they approached the conference room, Maria felt her heart racing. This was it, the moment that would determine not just their futures, but the future of Blackwood Industries and everyone who depended on it. Alexander reached out, taking her hand in his. "Together?" he asked softly. Maria squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his touch. "Together," she affirmed. The doors swung open, and they stepped into the lion's den. The conference room fell silent as Maria, Alexander, Victoria, and Harold entered. The faces around the table ranged from confused to hostile, with a few showing signs of nervous anticipation. At the head of the table sat Richard Hawthorne, the board chairman, his expression unreadable. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard demanded, his eyes narrowing as he took in the unlikely group before him. "Victoria, what are you doing here?" Victoria stepped forward, her chin held high. "I'm here to right some wrongs, Richard. Wrongs that have gone on for far too long." Over the next hour, Maria and Alexander laid out everything they had uncovered, the years of fraud, the bribes, the offshore accounts. They presented document after document, each one damning in its implications. As they spoke, the atmosphere in the room grew increasingly tense, with some board members shifting uncomfortably in their seats while others sat in stony silence. When they finished, Richard leaned back in his chair, his face ashen. "These are very serious allegations," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "If true, they could destroy this company." "They are true," Victoria interjected, her voice ringing clear in the stunned silence. Every word of it. I know because I was complicit in much of it. And I'm here to take responsibility for my actions. A murmur of shock ran through the room at Victoria's confession. Maria felt a surge of respect for the woman who had once been her nemesis. It took courage to admit to such wrongdoing, especially in front of those who had once held her in such high esteem. "So what do you propose we do?" Richard asked, his eyes moving from Victoria to Maria and Alexander. "If this gets out, it won't just be the end of Blackwood Industries. Many of us could face criminal charges." Alexander stepped forward, his voice firm. "We come clean," he said. "All of it. We work with the authorities, make restitution where we can, and rebuild the company from the ground up. It won't be easy, but it's the only way to salvage anything from this mess." As debate erupted around the table, Maria noticed movement out of the corner of her eye. One of the board members, a man she recognized as James Holloway, was slowly reaching into his jacket. With a jolt of terror, she realized what was about to happen. "Look out!" she cried, lunging forward just as Holloway pulled out a gun. The room erupted into chaos. People dove for cover as Holloway fired wildly, his face contorted with rage. "You'll ruin everything," he shouted. "I won't let you destroy what we've built." Alexander tackled Maria to the ground, shielding her with his body as bullets whizzed overhead. Victoria and Harold had taken cover behind an overturned table, while Richard and several other board members huddled in a corner. In the midst of the mayhem, Maria saw Holloway advancing towards them, his gun trained on Alexander. Without thinking, she grabbed a heavy crystal paperweight from the floor and hurled it with all her might. The paperweight struck Holloway's hand just as he was about to fire again. He cried out in pain, the gun clattering to the floor. In an instant, Harold was on him, wrestling him to the ground. As quickly as it had begun, the violence was over. The sound of sirens filled the air as police, alerted by the gunshots, stormed the building. Holloway was taken into custody, along with several other board members who had tried to flee in the confusion. In the aftermath, as paramedics tended to minor injuries and police took statements, Maria found herself standing by the window, looking out over the city she had come to call home. Alexander came to stand beside her, wrapping an arm around her waist. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his eyes searching her face. Maria nodded, leaning into his embrace. "I think so," she said. It's all so overwhelming. I never imagined it would come to this." "None of us did," Victoria's voice came from behind them. They turned to see her approaching, looking weary but resolute. "But thanks to you, Maria, we have a chance to make things right." As the three of them stood there, watching the sun climb higher in the sky, Maria felt a sense of closure beginning to settle over her. The road ahead would be difficult, there would be trials, both literal and figurative, to face. The company would need to be rebuilt almost from scratch. But for the first time in what felt like ages, the future seemed bright with possibility rather than shadowed. Buy secrets. Over the next few weeks, Oakridge was abuzz with the unfolding scandal. Blackwood Industries' stock plummeted as the extent of the corruption came to light. But even as the old guard fell, a new vision began to take shape. Maria, Alexander, and a core team of loyal employees worked tirelessly to salvage what they could of the company. They cooperated fully with the authorities, turned over evidence, and began the painstaking process of identifying and rectifying years of financial misdeeds. To everyone's surprise, it was Victoria who became the public face of the company's redemption. In a series of candid interviews and press conferences, she laid bare her own culpability and pledged to use her remaining years to make amends. Her honesty and apparent transformation captivated the public, turning what could have been a story of corporate greed into one of redemption and second chances. One evening, as Maria was preparing to leave the office after another long day, she found Alexander waiting for her by the elevator. "I have something to show you," he said, a hint of excitement in his voice. "Come with me?" Intrigued, Maria followed him to the roof of the building. As they stepped out into the cool night air, she gasped. The rooftop had been transformed into a beautiful garden, with twinkling lights strung overhead and fragrant flowers blooming in carefully tended beds. "Alexander, what is all this?" she asked, her eyes wide with wonder. He took her hands in his eyes shining with love. "This is the beginning of our new Blackwood Industries," he said. "A place of growth, of nurturing new ideas and new lives." And he dropped to one knee, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. "I'm hoping it will be the beginning of our new life together." Maria's heart soared as Alexander opened the box to reveal a beautiful, understated ring. "Maria Hernandez," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "you've been by my side through the darkest times and the brightest moments. You've taught me what true strength and integrity look like. Will you marry me?" Tears of joy spilled down Maria's cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak. As Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into a passionate kiss, she felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. Their moment of bliss was interrupted by the sound of applause. They turned to see Victoria standing by the rooftop entrance, a genuinely warm smile on her face. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, approaching the couple. "I just wanted to share some news." She handed them a newspaper, pointing to a small article near the back. "The Maria Hernandez Scholarship Fund," Alexander read aloud, his eyebrows raised in surprise. Victoria nodded, a hint of pride in her voice. "It's not much, but it's a start. A fund to help housekeepers and other service workers pursue higher education. I thought it might be a fitting way to honor your journey, Maria." Maria felt tears welling up again as she impulsively hugged Victoria. "Thank you," she whispered. "This means more than you know." As the three of them stood there on the rooftop, overlooking the city they had all played a part in changing, Maria felt a sense of peace wash over her. The journey had been long and often painful, but it had led her here, to a place of love, purpose, and the opportunity to make a real difference in the world. From humble housekeeper to CEO, from adversary to family, Maria had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of those around her. And as she looked to the future, hand in hand with Alexander and with Victoria's blessing, she knew that the best was yet to come. The sun began to set over Oakridge, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. As darkness fell, the city lights began to twinkle, mirroring the stars emerging overhead. Maria, Alexander, and Victoria stood in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the journey that had brought them to this moment. It was Victoria who finally broke the silence. "I never thought I'd say this," she began, her voice soft with emotion, "but I'm proud of you both. Proud of what you've accomplished, and proud of the people you've become." Alexander wrapped an arm around his mother's shoulders, pulling her into a gentle hug. "Thank you, Mother," he said. "Your support means more than you know." Maria watched the interaction with a full heart. The transformation in Victoria over the past weeks had been nothing short of miraculous. The cold, calculating woman she had once known had been replaced by someone softer, more reflective, someone capable of genuine warmth and compassion. As if reading her thoughts, Victoria turned to Maria. "And you, my dear," she said, taking Maria's hands in hers. "You've taught me more about strength and dignity than I ever thought possible. I know I can never fully make up for how I treated you in the past, but I hope we can move forward as family." Maria felt tears prick at her eyes as she squeezed Victoria's hands. "I'd like that," she said softly. As they made their way back inside, Maria couldn't help but marvel at the twists and turns her life had taken. From a small town in Mexico to the heights of corporate America, from a humble housekeeper to a beacon of integrity and change, it was a journey she could never have imagined. But as she looked at the man she loved and the woman who had become an unlikely ally, Maria knew that this was exactly where she was meant to be. The road ahead would not be easy. There were still challenges to face, a company to rebuild, and a legacy to reshape. But with love, determination, and the strength she had discovered within herself, Maria was ready for whatever the future might hold. As they stepped into the elevator, Maria caught sight of their reflection in the mirrored walls. She saw not just herself, Alexander, and Victoria, but the shadows of everyone who had been part of her journey, her parents, who had taught her the value of hard work, Carlos, her late husband, whose memory had given her strength in her darkest hours, Harold, whose quiet support had been a constant source of comfort. The elevator doors closed, and Maria felt a sense of closing one chapter of her life and opening another. As they descended towards the lobby, towards the future that awaited them, she made a silent vow to herself, to never forget where she came from, to always fight for what was right, and to use her newfound position to lift others up, just as she had been lifted. The elevator chimed, the doors sliding open to reveal the lobby. As they stepped out together, the unlikely trio who had changed the face of Blackwood Industries, Maria felt a surge of hope and determination. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And in doing so, they would write a new story, not just for themselves, but for everyone whose lives they touched. A story of redemption, of second chances, and of the transformative power of love and integrity. As they walked out into the cool night air, the stars twinkling overhead, Maria knew that this was not the end of her story. It was, in many ways, just the beginning. And she couldn't wait to see what the next chapter would bring. The streets of Oak Ridge were quiet as Maria, Alexander, and Victoria made their way to a small, family-owned restaurant, the very same one where Maria had worked as a dishwasher when she first arrived in the city, all those years ago. As they settled into a cozy booth, the owner, an elderly man named Joe, approached with a look of astonishment on his face. "Maria? Is that really you?" Maria stood, embracing the man with a warm smile. "It's me, Joe. It's been a long time." Joe shook his head in wonder. "I'll say. Last I heard, you were working up at the Blackwood place. And now look at you, I've been seeing your face all over the news. You're a real success story, girl." Maria felt a blush creep up her cheeks. "I've been fortunate," she said modestly. "But I've never forgotten where I came from, or the people who helped me along the way." As Joe took their orders and bustled away, Alexander reached across the table, taking Maria's hand in his. "You never cease to amaze me," he said softly. "Your humility, your grace, it's what made me fall in love with you in the first place." Victoria nodded in agreement. "It's what's going to make you an exceptional leader for Blackwood Industries moving forward," she added. "Your ability to connect with people from all walks of life, it's a rare and valuable gift." As they enjoyed their meal, sharing stories and laughing together, Maria felt a sense of coming full circle. From her first days in Oak Ridge, struggling to make ends meet, to now, engaged to the man she loved, respected by the woman she had once feared, and poised to lead one of the city's most influential companies into a new era. But even as she reveled in the moment, Maria knew that her work was far from over. The challenges ahead were daunting, rebuilding the company's reputation, implementing new ethical standards, and using their resources to make a positive impact on the community. As they left the restaurant, stepping out into the cool night air, Maria paused for a moment, looking up at the stars. She thought of all the people who had played a part in her journey, the ones who had supported her, the ones who had doubted her, and even those who had tried to stand in her way. Each of them had shaped her, had contributed to the woman she had become. With a soft smile, she turned to Alexander and Victoria. "You know," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination, "I think we have an opportunity here. Not just to rebuild Blackwood Industries, but to redefine what a corporation can be in today's world. Alexander squeezed her hand encouragingly. "What do you mean?" Maria's eyes shone with passion as she continued, "I mean, we can create a company that truly puts people first. One that invests in its employees, gives back to the community, and sets a new standard for corporate responsibility. We can show the world that success and integrity aren't mutually exclusive, they're essential to each other." Victoria nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression on her face. "It won't be easy," she cautioned. "There will be resistance, both from within the company and from our competitors." "I know," Maria acknowledged. "But I think it's worth fighting for. We have a chance to make a real difference, to leave a legacy that goes beyond profit margins and stock prices." Alexander's face lit up with enthusiasm. "You're right. We can use our resources to create educational programs, fund community initiatives, maybe even start a microloan program for small businesses." Victoria listened to their ideas, a small smile playing on her lips. "You know," she said softly, "watching you two, I can't help but think of how far we've all come. Maria, when I first met you, I saw you as nothing more than a servant. And now I see you as the future of everything we've built." Maria felt tears prick at her eyes at Victoria's words. The journey from that first day at the Blackwood mansion to this moment had been long and often painful, but it had led her to a place she could never have imagined. As they walked back to the car, the cool night air filled with the sounds of the city winding down, Maria felt a surge of determination. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight. But for tonight, she allowed herself to bask in the warmth of love, acceptance, and the promise of a brighter future. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a new day full of possibility. Maria woke early, her mind already racing with ideas and plans. As she and Alexander arrived at Blackwood Industries, they were met with a mix of apprehension and hope from the employees. Maria took a deep breath as she stepped up to the podium in the company's main atrium. Faces looked up at her, some familiar, some new, all waiting to hear what the future held for them. "Good morning," she began, her voice clear and strong. "I know the past few weeks have been difficult and uncertain for all of us. But today, we stand at the beginning of a new chapter for Blackwood Industries." As she spoke, outlining her vision for a company built on integrity, innovation, and social responsibility, Maria could see the spark of hope igniting in the eyes of those around her. She talked about new initiatives, mentorship programs, community outreach, sustainable business practices, and with each word, the energy in the room seemed to grow. "We have a long road ahead of us," she concluded, "but I believe that together, we can build something truly extraordinary. A company that not only succeeds in business but makes a real, positive impact on the world around us." The applause that followed was thunderous, filled with a renewed sense of purpose and excitement. As Maria stepped down from the podium, she was surrounded by employees eager to share their own ideas and contribute to this new vision. In the weeks and months that followed, Blackwood Industries underwent a transformation. Under Maria and Alexander's leadership, the company became a model of corporate responsibility. They implemented fair wage policies, launched education programs for employees and their families, and partnered with local organizations to revitalize struggling neighborhoods. The road wasn't always smooth. There were setbacks and challenges, moments of doubt and frustration. But through it all, Maria never lost sight of her vision or her determination to make a difference. 1 year after that fateful board meeting that had changed everything, Maria stood on the rooftop garden of Blackwood Industries, looking out over the city she now called home. The garden had flourished, much like the company itself, growing into a vibrant, thriving space. Alexander joined her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pressing a kiss to her temple. "Penny for your thoughts," he murmured. Maria leaned back against him, a contented smile on her face. "I was just thinking about how far we've come," she said softly. A year ago, I never could have imagined this. You've done amazing things, Maria, Alexander said, his voice filled with pride. You've changed this company, this city, you've changed lives. As if on cue, the rooftop door opened and Victoria emerged, followed by a group of young women. Maria recognized them as the first recipients of the Maria Hernandez Scholarship, former housekeepers and service workers now pursuing their dreams of higher education. Victoria approached them, a warm smile on her face. "I hope we're not interrupting," she said. "But these young ladies wanted to thank you personally, Maria." As Maria listened to their stories, of obstacles overcome, of dreams now within reach, she felt a profound sense of fulfillment. This, she realized, was the true measure of success. Not the numbers on a balance sheet or the headlines in the business news, but the real, tangible impact on people's lives. Later that evening, as Maria prepared for bed, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. The woman who looked back at her was a far cry from the timid housekeeper who had once trembled under Victoria's stern gaze. This woman stood tall, her eyes shining with confidence and purpose. She touched the locket around her neck, Victoria's gift, now a symbol not of past hurts but of growth and reconciliation. Inside, she had placed a small photo of herself, Alexander, and Victoria, taken at the company's last charity gala. A reminder of how far they had all come and of the family they had become. As she climbed into bed beside Alexander, Maria felt a deep sense of peace. The journey had been long and often difficult, but it had led her exactly where she was meant to be. She had found love, purpose, and a platform to make a real difference in the world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to grow and to give back. But for now, in the quiet of the night, Maria allowed herself to simply be grateful. For second chances, for unexpected allies, and for the strength she had discovered within herself. As she drifted off to sleep, Maria's last thoughts were of the future, bright, full of promise, and limited only by the scope of their dreams. The humble housekeeper had become a beacon of hope and change, proof that with courage, integrity, and compassion, anything was possible. And this, Maria knew, was only the beginning. 5 years had passed since the tumultuous events that had transformed Blackwood Industries and the lives of Maria, Alexander, and Victoria. Oak Ridge had changed too, evolving into a city known for its progressive business practices and community-focused initiatives, with Blackwood Industries leading the charge. On a warm summer morning, Maria stood in front of the full-length mirror in her bedroom, smoothing down the fabric of her elegant white dress. Today was a day she had dreamed of for so long, her wedding day. As she fastened the locket Victoria had given her around her neck, a soft knock at the door caught her attention. "Come in," she called, turning to see Victoria entering the room, her eyes misty with unshed tears. "Oh, Maria," Victoria breathed, taking in the sight before her. "You look absolutely beautiful." Maria smiled, reaching out to take Victoria's hands in hers. "Thank you," she said softly. "For everything. I never imagined, all those years ago, that you'd be here with me on this day." Victoria squeezed her hands gently. "Neither did I," she admitted. "But I'm so grateful that I am. You've taught me so much about forgiveness, about redemption. You've become the daughter I never had." As the two women embraced, both teary-eyed, there was another knock at the door. Harold poked his head in, a broad smile on his face. "It's time, ladies," he announced. "Are we ready to make an honest man out of my nephew?" Maria laughed, her heart light with joy. "More than ready," she replied. The ceremony was held in the rooftop garden of Blackwood Industries, the very place where Alexander had proposed. The space had been transformed into a floral paradise, with fragrant blooms and twinkling lights creating a magical atmosphere. As Maria walked down the aisle on Harold's arm, she saw faces both old and new among the guests. There was Joe from the restaurant, beaming proudly. The young women from the scholarship program, some now successful professionals in their own right. Employees of Blackwood Industries, from executives to janitors, all equal in their celebration of this day. And at the end of the aisle stood Alexander, his eyes shining with love and adoration. As she reached him, taking his hands in hers, Maria felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. The ceremony was simple but deeply moving. Maria and Alexander exchanged vows they had written themselves, promises of love, partnership, and continued dedication to making the world a better place. As they were pronounced husband and wife, the garden erupted in cheers and applause. At the reception that followed, Maria found herself constantly surrounded by well-wishers. She was in the middle of a conversation with a group of scholarship recipients when she felt a tap on her shoulder. Turning, she found herself face to face with a familiar figure, James Holloway, the board member who had tried to shoot her all those years ago. Maria tensed for a moment, but the man before her bore little resemblance to the angry, desperate individual she remembered. Holloway looked older, humbled, his eyes filled with remorse. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said softly, using her new name. I owe you an apology. More than an apology. What I did was unforgivable, and I've spent every day since then regretting my actions." Maria studied him for a moment, seeing the genuine regret in his eyes. "Mr. Holloway," she replied, her voice gentle but firm. "Thank you for your apology. I hope you found a way to make amends for your actions." Holloway nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "I have, thanks to you. The restorative justice program you implemented at Blackwood Industries, it changed my life. I've been working with at-risk youth, trying to steer them away from the path I took. It's not much, but..." "It's everything," Maria interrupted, placing a hand on his arm. "Every life you touch, every young person you help, that's how we create real change." As Holloway walked away, visibly moved by their interaction, Alexander appeared at Maria's side. "Everything okay?" he asked, a hint of concern in his voice. Maria nodded, leaning into him. "Everything's perfect," she said softly. "I was just reminded of how far we've all come." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of laughter, dancing, and heartfelt toasts. As the night wore on, Maria found herself stepping away from the festivities for a moment, seeking a quiet spot to catch her breath. She found herself at the edge of the rooftop, looking out over the city she had come to love. The lights of Oak Ridge twinkled below, a testament to the vibrant, thriving community it had become. "Quite a view, isn't it?" Victoria's voice came from behind her. The older woman joined her at the railing, a glass of champagne in her hand. Maria nodded, smiling softly. "It's beautiful," she agreed. "Sometimes I still can't believe how much has changed." Victoria was quiet for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. "You know," she said finally, "when I first hired you as a housekeeper all those years ago, I thought I was just getting someone to clean the mansion. I never imagined I was inviting in the person who would save our family, our company, and in many ways, this entire city." Maria felt tears prick at her eyes at Victoria's words. "I didn't do it alone," she said softly. "I had help every step of the way. From Alexander, from you, from so many others." Victoria turned to her, her eyes shining with emotion. "But it was your heart, your integrity, that showed us the way. You never lost sight of who you were, no matter what life threw at you. That's a rare and precious thing, Maria." As they stood there, the sounds of the reception drifting up from below, Maria felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. For every hardship that had led her to this moment, for every person who had shaped her journey. The night wound down, guests slowly departing with warm hugs and heartfelt congratulations. As the last of them left, Maria found herself once again in the center of the rooftop garden, surrounded by the people she loved most in the world. Alexander wrapped his arms around her from behind, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Happy, Mrs. Blackwood?" he murmured. Maria leaned back against him, a contented smile on her face. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she replied. Victoria approached, Harold at her side. "Well, you too," she said, a mischievous glint in her eye. "I think it's about time you got started on the next generation of Blackwoods, don't you?" Maria and Alexander exchanged a meaningful glance, matching smiles spreading across their faces. "Actually," Maria said, her hand moving to rest on her stomach, "we're already ahead of you on that one." The joy that erupted at her announcement was palpable, with hugs and tears all around. As the small group celebrated this new life, this new beginning, Maria felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. Later that night, as she and Alexander prepared to leave for their honeymoon, Maria took one last look around the rooftop garden. So much had happened here: proposals and confrontations, new beginnings and reconciliations. It was a fitting place to start this new chapter of their lives. "Ready to go, love?" Alexander asked, offering her his hand. Maria nodded, taking his hand and squeezing it gently. "Ready for anything," she replied, "as long as I'm with you." As they made their way to the waiting car, rose petals scattered at their feet and the cheers of their loved ones echoing in their ears, Maria felt a sense of completion. The journey that had begun all those years ago, when a humble housekeeper had first set foot in the Blackwood mansion, had led her here, to love, to family, to a future brighter than she had ever dared to dream. But even as one chapter closed, another was beginning. There would be new challenges to face, new battles to fight. A child to raise, a company to lead, a community to serve. But Maria knew that whatever lay ahead, she would face it with courage, with integrity, and with the love and support of the family she had found along the way. As the car pulled away from Blackwood Industries, Maria looked back at the building that had been the center of so much of her life. It stood tall and proud against the night sky, a beacon of hope and change in the heart of Oak Ridge. "Thinking about the future?" Alexander asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Maria smiled, turning back to him. "Thinking about how lucky I am," she replied. "And how excited I am for whatever comes next." Alexander lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Whatever it is," he said softly, "we'll face it together." As they drove through the streets of Oak Ridge, heading towards their future, Maria felt a sense of peace settle over her. The road ahead might not always be easy, but she was ready for it. Ready to love, to lead, to make a difference in whatever way she could. From humble housekeeper to CEO, from outsider to beloved member of the community, Maria's journey had been one of transformation, not just for herself, but for everyone whose lives she had touched along the way. And as the city lights faded behind them and the open road stretched out ahead, Maria knew that this was not the end of her story. It was, in many ways, just the beginning. A new chapter, filled with endless possibilities and the promise of a future built on love, integrity, and the unshakable belief that one person really could change the world. 5 years later, Maria stood at the podium in the grand ballroom of Oak Ridge's finest hotel, her heart swelling with pride as she looked out at the sea of faces before her. It was the 5th anniversary gala of the Maria Hernandez Foundation, and the room was filled with scholarship recipients, community leaders, and supporters from all walks of life. At a table near the front sat Alexander, bouncing their 4-year-old daughter, Sophia, on his knee. Victoria sat beside them, her once sharp features now softened by age and happiness, doting on her granddaughter. Harold was there too, his eyes twinkling with pride as he watched Maria address the crowd. 5 years ago, Maria began, her voice strong and clear, "We had a dream. A dream of creating opportunities for those who had been overlooked, of breaking down barriers and building bridges. Today, as I look around this room, I see that dream becoming a reality. She went on to highlight the foundation's achievements: hundreds of scholarships awarded, dozens of community programs launched, partnerships formed with businesses across Oak Ridge to create job opportunities and mentorship programs. But our work is far from over, she continued, her voice filled with passion. As we celebrate our successes, we must also look to the future, to the challenges that still lie ahead and the lives we have yet to touch. As she spoke, Maria couldn't help but reflect on her own journey. From the scared young woman who had arrived in Oak Ridge with nothing but hope and determination, to the leader she had become. Every hardship, every obstacle had led her to this moment. After her speech, as she mingled with the guests, Maria found herself approached by a young woman with a familiar face. It took her a moment to place her, Anna, one of the first scholarship recipients. "Mrs. Blackwood," Anna said, her eyes shining with gratitude. "I just wanted to thank you. The scholarship, it changed my life. I'm starting medical school in the fall." Maria felt tears prick at her eyes as she pulled Anna into a warm hug. "I'm so proud of you," she said softly. "This is exactly why we do what we do." As the evening wore on, Maria found herself continuously moved by the stories she heard, of lives transformed, of dreams realized, of hope restored. Each tale was a reminder of the ripple effect of kindness and opportunity, of the power of believing in people. Later, as the gala was winding down, Maria stepped out onto the hotel's balcony for a moment of quiet reflection. The night air was cool and crisp, the city lights twinkling below like earthbound stars. She felt a presence beside her and turned to see Victoria joining her, a gentle smile on her face. "Quite a night," Victoria said, her voice warm with pride. "You've built something truly remarkable, Maria." Maria nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "Sometimes I still can't believe how far we've come," she admitted. "From those days in the mansion, it feels like another lifetime." Victoria was quiet for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. "You know," she said finally, "I've been thinking a lot about those days lately. About the person I was, the things I did." Maria turned to her, seeing the mix of regret and hope in the older woman's eyes. "I was so wrong," Victoria continued. "About you, about so many things. But watching you tonight, seeing all the lives you've touched, I realized that my greatest legacy isn't the Blackwood name or fortune. It's you, Maria. The day I hired you as a housekeeper was the best decision I ever made, even if I didn't know it at the time." Tears spilled down Maria's cheeks as she embraced Victoria, the last vestiges of their old relationship melting away in the warmth of mutual respect and affection. As they parted, Alexander appeared in the doorway, little Sophia sleepy in his arms. "There are my girls," he said softly, his eyes filled with love as he looked at Maria and Victoria. Maria took Sophia from him, cradling her daughter close. As the child snuggled into her shoulder, Maria felt a profound sense of continuity, of past, present, and future intertwining. "You know," she said, looking from Victoria to Alexander, "I think it's time we start planning for the next phase of the foundation. Maybe a focus on early childhood education? Give kids a head start on their dreams?" Alexander grinned, wrapping an arm around her waist. "Always thinking ahead," he teased gently. "But I love the idea. What do you think, Mother?" Victoria nodded, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "I think it's perfect. A chance to shape the future from the very beginning." As they stood there, this unlikely family brought together by fate and forged by love, Maria felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This was her legacy, not just the foundation or the company, but the bonds she had formed, the lives she had touched, the change she had inspired. From humble housekeeper to respected leader, from outsider to the heart of a community, Maria's journey had been one of transformation. But through it all, she had remained true to herself, to the values of hard work, integrity, and compassion that had guided her from the very beginning. As they made their way back inside, rejoining the celebration, Maria knew that this was not the end of her story. There would be new challenges to face, new dreams to pursue. But with her family by her side and the strength she had discovered within herself, she was ready for whatever the future might hold. The night wind carried the sound of laughter and music from the ballroom, a joyful melody of lives changed and hope renewed. And in that moment, Maria knew that this feeling of love, of purpose, of making a real difference in the world, this was the true meaning of success. It was everything she had ever dreamed of, and more than she had ever dared to hope. And it was only the beginning. As the gala came to a close and the last of the guests departed, Maria found herself once again on the balcony, this time with Alexander by her side. Sophia had fallen asleep in Victoria's arms, the older woman having volunteered to take her granddaughter home so the couple could have a moment alone. "Quite a night," Alexander said softly, wrapping his arm around Maria's waist and pulling her close. Maria nodded, leaning into him. "It's amazing, isn't it? To see how far we've come, how many lives we've touched." Alexander pressed a kiss to her temple. "It's all because of you, you know. Your vision, your heart. You've changed everything, Maria." She turned to face him, her eyes shining with love and determination. "We've changed everything," she corrected gently. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, without your support and your belief in me." As they stood there, the city spread out before them, Maria felt a familiar stirring in her heart, the call to do more, to reach further, to keep pushing for change. "You know," she said, a hint of excitement creeping into her voice, "I've been thinking. What if we expanded the Foundation's reach? Not just in Oak Ridge, but to other cities, other countries even?" Alexander grinned, recognizing the spark of a new dream in his wife's eyes. "I think that sounds like an incredible idea," he said. "Just like everything else you've done, it'll change lives." Maria's eyes lit up with excitement. "We could start with cities similar to Oak Ridge, maybe partner with local businesses and community leaders. Then, who knows? Maybe we could even take it international, help people in countries where opportunities are even more limited." As they discussed the possibilities, their voices animated with passion and purpose, neither of them noticed Victoria returning to the balcony. "I couldn't help but overhear," she said, a warm smile on her face. "And I think it's a wonderful idea. In fact, I'd like to help make it happen." Maria and Alexander turned to her, surprise evident on their faces. Victoria continued, her voice filled with determination. "I've been thinking about my own legacy, about how I want to be remembered. And I've decided to donate the majority of my personal fortune to the foundation. It's time that money did some real good in the world." Tears welled up in Maria's eyes as she embraced Victoria. "Thank you," she whispered. "This will change so many lives." As the three of them stood there, the cool night air filled with the promise of new beginnings, Maria felt a sense of completion. The journey that had begun all those years ago, when a humble housekeeper had first set foot in the Blackwood mansion, had led her here, to a place where she could make a real, lasting difference in the world. But even as one chapter closed, another was beginning. There would be new challenges to face, new dreams to pursue. But Maria knew that with her family by her side and the strength she had discovered within herself, anything was possible. As they made their way back inside, preparing to head home, Maria paused for one last look at the city spread out before them. Oak Ridge had changed so much in the years since she'd first arrived, and she had changed with it. From a scared young woman with nothing but hope and determination, to a leader, a wife, a mother, and a beacon of change. "Ready to go home, love?" Alexander asked, offering her his hand. Maria smiled, taking his hand and squeezing it gently. "Home," she repeated softly. "You know, there was a time when I didn't know if I'd ever truly have a home. And now." And now you've made a home for so many others, Victoria finished, her voice warm with pride. As they left the hotel, stepping out into the cool night air, Maria felt a sense of excitement for the future. The road ahead would undoubtedly have its challenges, but she was ready to face them. Ready to continue fighting for what was right, to keep pushing for change, to never stop believing in the power of second chances and the strength of the human spirit. From humble housekeeper to philanthropist, from outsider to the heart of a community, Maria's journey had been one of transformation. But through it all, she had remained true to herself, to the values of hard work, integrity, and compassion that had guided her from the very beginning. As they drove through the quiet streets of Oak Ridge, Maria looked out at the city she now called home. Each street corner, each building held memories of struggles overcome, of lives touched, of dreams realized. And in every face she saw, she recognized the potential for change, the spark of hope that she had once carried within herself. Arriving home, they found Harold waiting up for them, little Sophia fast asleep in his arms. As Maria took her daughter, cradling her close, she felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. For every hardship that had led her to this moment, for every person who had shaped her journey. Later that night, as she stood in Sophia's room, watching her daughter sleep peacefully, Maria felt Alexander's arms wrap around her from behind. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured, his voice soft in the quiet room. Maria leaned back against him, a contented smile on her face. "Everything," she said. "Where we've been, where we're going. The lives we've touched, the ones we've yet to reach." Alexander pressed a kiss to her temple. "Well, whatever comes next, we'll face it together. Just like we always have." As they stood there, bathed in the soft glow of the nightlight, Maria felt a sense of peace settle over her. The journey had been long and often difficult, but it had led her exactly where she was meant to be. In that moment, surrounded by the love of her family and filled with hope for the future, Maria knew that this was just the beginning. There were more lives to touch, more changes to make, more love to give. And she was ready for it all. From the humble housekeeper who had once trembled under Victoria's stern gaze, to the confident leader who now stood tall, inspiring others to reach for their dreams, Maria had come full circle. But her story was far from over. In fact, in many ways, it was just beginning. As she and Alexander quietly left Sophia's room, hand in hand, Maria's heart was full of gratitude for the past and excitement for the future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever new dreams were yet to be dreamed, she knew that with love, determination, and the unshakable belief in the power of second chances, anything was possible. And so, as the stars twinkled overhead and the city of Oak Ridge slept peacefully below, Maria Hernandez Blackwood, once a humble housekeeper, now a beacon of hope and change, looked to the future with open arms and an open heart, ready for whatever adventures tomorrow might bring. For in the end, she had learned that the greatest legacy one could leave was not in wealth or status, but in the lives touched, the hope inspired, and the love shared. And by that measure, Maria's legacy was only just beginning to unfold.